Good morning, everybody. My name is Ettore Greco. I am the Executive Vice President of the International Affairs Institute and the head of its program on multilateralism and global governance. I'm very glad to open and share this webinar. Today, we want to discuss the challenges, opportunities, and policy priorities of the Italian presidency of the G20 next year in view of the impact of the COVID-19 epidemic. This seminar is part of a program supported by the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation and the Compagnia di San Paolo, Turin, which we have conducted in the last few months, taking advantage of the inputs we have received from the G20 group at the Prime Ministerial Office. Let me thank all our partners and supporters, and of course the think tankers and scholars who have accepted our invitation to intervene in this meeting. They are all renowned experts and leading figures within the global networks working on the G20 agenda. I give immediately the floor for the welcome addresses to Ferdinando Nelli Feroci, President of our Institute, and Francesco Profumo, President of the Compagnia di San Paolo, our strategic partner. We will then have a round table with 5 panelists, followed by the speech by Pietro Benassi, diplomatic advisor to the Italian Prime Minister and G20 Sherpa, and then by Q&A. At the end of the meeting, Professor Paola Subacchi from the Queen Mary University will make some concluding remarks. Ferdinando, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ettore, and welcome to everybody to this webinar. As already Ettore has mentioned, today we will discuss the priorities of the G20 in the post-COVID world, if I may say so. And this seminar is the concluding event of a project which was devoted to the G20 priorities and which has been conducted by the Istituto Affari Internazionali with the support and collaboration of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and of the Compagnia di San Paolo di Torino, which is the strategic partner of the Institute. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank both the Ministry and the Compagnia for their very valuable support. May I add one personal word of thanks to Francesco Profumo, the president of the Compagnia, who is with us this morning and will intervene immediately after my brief remarks. The project we have developed focused on 4 main subjects, which were considered when we decided to choose those subjects as inevitable elements of an agenda of the G20 during the Italian presidency. And I will mention them very briefly. The first one is international trade and the reform of the WTO, the challenges of digitalization and the role the G20 could play in promoting digitalization, the challenges of aging societies, and the role of G20 in support of circular economy. By the way, may I also add that the Istituto is conducting a parallel research project supported this time by the Ministry of Economy, which is focused on the role of infrastructural investment, and also that the IAI, together with ISPI, another Italian think tank, will co-share the activities of the G20, G20 being a network of institute and research centers which are supposed to develop and policy recommendations for the leaders related to the agenda of the G20. Now, when we launched this project that I mentioned, and when we chose the subject that were the center of our project, COVID was not even foreseeable. But now COVID is at the center of the international scene. It's affected in a very radical and would also say dramatic manner, not only our own personal lives, but also the agendas of national governments and international institutions. So it's inevitable that the G20 will have to redefine its agenda and its priorities in the light of the impact of COVID in global governance and in general on international cooperation. We have seen that at least even though COVID unfortunately is still there and still remains a threat for our societies and for our economies, we can already evaluate its impact at least on 3 levels. Certainly, COVID has provoked a health emergency with an enormous pressure on sanitary services pressed in all the world, even though in different manner and with different weight. It's still a threat to our well-being, and it will certainly require a better and more effective international cooperation, at least to make it possible for our societies to become more resilient, to be able to develop effective therapies, and not last, to develop as soon as possible vaccine that should be distributed worldwide. Then COVID has provoked an economic emergency. We are witnessing elements of an economic recession unprecedented, at least since 1945, with enormous impact on our countries. Some of them have been more affected than others, but altogether this is a global recession which has affected global economy and which will continue to require concerted actions, not only national measures, as it has been the case so far, but also concerted actions to limit the effects of this recession, to counter the risk of a prolonged recession. And third, COVID has also provoked a social emergency. We've seen this with a dramatic increase in the level of unemployment, with also a dramatic increase in the level of inequalities in wealth distribution, and also with serious challenges for our sanitary services and educational services. And again, also this emergency will require more and better international cooperation. So this is why we have come to the conclusion that G20 this year will have a very special responsibility. This is true in any year, if possible. G20 has responsibilities. In some cases, it has been able to perform in a very effective manner these responsibilities. In other occasions, a bit less. But this year it's a special case because of COVID and because of the impact of COVID on global governance. The G20 will have to demonstrate that international cooperation matters and it can make the difference, particularly in dealing with such a complex situation. That G20 will have to provide answers to the challenges of a post-COVID world, and will have to contribute to a relaunch of a more effective and more inclusive multilateralism. So an agenda which is also a great challenge for the G20 and for the countries that participate in the G20. Now, we do not pretend with this seminar, of course, to dictate the agenda of the Italian presidency. We would simply like to contribute to focus on some ideas, some suggestions, some policy recommendations that would appear especially relevant and urgent in this conjunction, in this particular context. This is all what I wanted to say. Let me conclude by thanking wholeheartedly all those that have accepted to participate in this seminar from different parties of the world, even very distant parties of the world. Let me thank, even though he's not with us, but I do it now because later I will not be able to speak again, Piero Benassi, a very good friend of mine and a colleague of mine until a few years ago, who is a diplomatic advisor to the Prime Minister and G20 Sherpa. And let me also add to this that we are very interested in listening to him, to get some very preliminary hints on the possible content of an agenda of the Italian presidency. And last but not least, a special thank you to all those at the Institute, from Ettore, Fabrizio, and Nicola, have contributed not only to the organization of this event, but also to the development of the project that I mentioned before. Thank you very much, Ettore. The floor is back to you again.
Many thanks, Ferdinando. I have now the great pleasure to give the floor to Professor Francesco Profumo, President of the Compagnia di San Paolo. As Ferdinando has underlined, we have a comprehensive strategic partnership with the Compagnia, a partnership that covers a wide range of issues, including in particular several projects dealing with the problems of global governance. So thanks again, Professor Profumo, for your continued and precious support. And now the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ettore, and thank you, Mr. President. I'm very pleased that today you launched this seminar because we really think that in this spatial life that we have today, it's necessary to continue to have discussions, to have the possibility just to look for the future and not only for what happened today. As a Compagnia di San Paolo, we are very stressed from this particular time, and in the meantime, we feel that we need to continue to invest for the future, and our collaboration with IAI, it's very important because it's for us an open view for what is happening all around the world. Then I'm very pleased that you organized this seminar, and I want to thank all the people that are participating in this event. And thank you, and have a very, very good job. Thank you.
Many thanks, Professor Profumo. It's now the turn of our panelists. We have indeed a great panel with, as I said, leading experts of global governance issues, and also in particular the role of the G20 with different specializations. Let me briefly present them. Hossa Al-Mutairi, Saudi Arabia Sherpa for T20, and lead co-chair task force of the T20, a sustainable energy, water, and food system in Riyadh. The T20 is a network of leading institutes working on the G20 agenda during the various presidencies. And we will be, as an institute, heavily involved in the activities of the G20 next year. Then Creon Butler, Director of Global Economy and Finance Program at Chatham House in London. Professor Sakin Chitervidi, Director General of the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, which is a New Delhi-based think tank. Andrei Bistrisky, Chairman of the Valdai Club Foundation in Moscow. Dennis Kurlish, Head of Global Challenges Center at the Kiel Institute, and also Research Director of the Global Solution Initiative. And last but not least, Elizabeth Sidiropoulos, Chief Executive of the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg. Now, please, Dr. Al-Mutairi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ettore, and thank you very much for the invitation. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted and honored to be here with you, and congratulations to the IAA for taking the role for the T20. I would like to start by emphasizing on a few points related to the G20 and T20 in the context of Saudi Arabia's presidency. As you know, the theme of the Saudi G20 presidency is realizing opportunities of the 21st century for all, with a focus on three aims: empowering people, safeguarding the planet, and shaping new frontiers. The T20 Saudi Arabia has initially established 10 task forces to address the G20 priorities. 8 task forces cover topics existing in T20 Argentina and Japan. And we have introduced 2 new task forces, one on young societies and the other one on energy, water, and food. And as the Mr. President was mentioning, that COVID-19 actually changed priorities. So in April, we introduced an 11th task force on COVID-19 pandemic. And this crisis actually is different. Past major crises, the Asian financial crisis and the Great Recession, among others, started and often remained confined in economic and financial spheres, requiring remedies that policymakers were familiar with. But the current COVID-19 crisis is different. It started as a health crisis before turning into a global crisis with multiple ripple effects on economies and societies. And tragically, the COVID-19 pandemic has claimed more than 1 million lives and challenged the global public health system and triggered the largest economic shock since the Great Depression. The G20 has made great effort to address the multiple challenges created by the pandemic. And I will only mention a few examples. The G20 effectively met in an extraordinary virtual summit on March 26 to address challenges posed by the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the G20 leaders asked their finance minister and central bank governors to coordinate on a regular basis to develop a G20 action plan in response to COVID-19. The action plan outlines several financial responses, including the G20 debt service suspension initiatives to support low-income countries, and a comprehensive IMF support package, the support proposed by the World Bank Group and multilateral development banks amounting to more than $200 billion. This year, the G20 have addressed several priorities, but I will focus today on sustainable resources. As we all know, all civilization need energy, water, and food to prosper. Unfortunately, many people still do not have sufficient access to these resources. And at the same time, both production and consumption of resources need to be more sustainable. Transitions are already happening, and it might accelerate in the future, although the pace of transitions is uncertain. This could disproportionately depend on fossil resources endowment, have scarce water resources, or import food, as the case in the MENA region. Over the past 12 years, energy took importance in the G20 agenda. At the global scale, the G20 group accounts for 77% of global energy consumption, 80% of world's installed renewable capacity, and the G20 comprises the 3 biggest oil producers, USA, Saudi Arabia, and Russia. It accounts for 80% of global trade in agriculture and 60% of agricultural land. The energy was first mentioned at the Washington Summit in 2008, and the first G20 Energy Ministers meeting was held in 2015, and the Energy Transition Steering Committee was launched at the 2018 Buenos Aires Summit. The COVID-19 pandemic has reinforced the importance of sustainable resources in the G20 agenda. Among other things, the pandemic has tested the resilience of supply chains and destabilized the global markets. In some cases, it has weakened the multilateral trade system, for instance, with certain countries enforcing export controls of agricultural products. On the contrary, in other cases, the crisis has reinforced the multilateral system and international cooperation. A powerful example of this is the extraordinary G20 Energy Ministers meeting held on April 10th to address energy market stability in the face of the unprecedented demand shock caused by the pandemic. It had been preceded the day before by an extraordinary OPEC and non-OPEC ministerial meeting that laid the foundation for collective action to rebalance the oil market. And the G20 has acknowledged that maintaining the stability of oil markets throughout the crisis and during the recovery is vital. And beyond the short-term problems, long-term challenges still need to be addressed. And this is reflected by the G20 energy ministers' endorsement of the circular carbon economy, CCE, last week. The CCE is a holistic, integrated, inclusive, and pragmatic approach to managing emissions that can be applied, reflecting countries' priorities and circumstances. The CCE framework is essential to lowering emissions and transitioning to cleaner and sustainable energy systems. It builds on a well-established and widely used model, the circular economy, and I'm glad that Mr. President mentioned this as a priority. And this framework has the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, and recycle. But the CCE adds the 4th element, remove. I think this is a topic that is important, as Mr. President mentioned, for the Italian G20 presidency, given the interest of the EU in the topic. The EU has designed a new strategy for the circular economy, as you know. An additional topic that is related to energy, CCE, and is hydrogen. And Saudi Arabia has focused on low carbon hydrogen, green and blue, as it can play a unique role for fostering cleaner pathways. Affordable and reliable energy access for all should also remain a priority, and energy security will remain an important topic. We hope to see most of these topics on the G20 Italian presidency agenda, because of its importance either for the European Union or for the G20 and the world as well. And thank you very much for this.
Many thanks, Dr. Butairi. And now it's the turn, let me give the floor to Creon Butler, Director of Global Economy and Finance Program at Chatham House in London.
Well, thank you very much, Ettore, and thank you very much to the IAI for inviting me today. Given the shortage of time, I'd like to make 3 general points and then 4 more focused ones on the finance and economy track, which I think in particular you were keen I would address. So my first general point is on uncertainty. And I think the key thing is to appreciate that the level of uncertainty the world faces today is extraordinarily high. And it's not just uncertainty about the short-term evolution of the pandemic, but also about the world we live in. And it now seems that very high impact shocks like the pandemic could well be part of our steady state that we live with in the future. And for an institution like the G20, I think it's very important to sort of take this on board in terms of how we address the future agendas. My second general point is that in addressing the current crisis, we must remain clearly focused on the even bigger and existential crisis, which is unfortunately a certainty, which is the crisis of climate change. And in tackling the pandemic, we have to factor that in a very fundamental way. And then thirdly, it's very clear that the most effective way of addressing all these issues is through multilateral cooperation. So it's very much the right thing that the Italian presidency is focusing on this. We all know the reasons why it has been lacking in the last few years, and notwithstanding the efforts of the Saudi presidency, notably the skepticism of the US about multilateral action more generally, but also the behavior of some other G20 countries has undermined cooperation through unilateral action and in some cases illegal actions that conflict with the norms of international cooperation. So it's very much to be hoped that the conditions for cooperation will improve next year. And if so, I think there are 2 really important priorities. First, to change the language so that the way we speak about cooperation in a sense returns to some extent to the way we spoke about it after the 2010 crisis, but also and critically to focus on a number of practical, politically realistic and concrete steps which demonstrate that cooperation can work and get people back in the habit of doing it. I think in a sense, this will be the starting point to reviving this key aspect of the way the world economy works in the future. Now, turning quickly to the finance and economy track, the national level response has been completely unprecedented. And I think if you look at the IMF figuring, it's something like $11 to $12 trillion total measures so far have been taken. And some elements of this have been coordinated, as our colleague from Saudi Arabia was saying. And I think you could particularly point to, in the finance track, to the dollar liquidity measures that were taken by central banks and also by the G20 debt service suspension. But unfortunately, at an overall level, it has been weak and very much less than one would have expected given the scale of the crisis. So I would highlight 4 categories of activity for the Italian presidency next year. And you know, I'm picking specific things in each of these areas, but obviously there's an enormous range to choose for. So first of all, the immediate crisis response. And in that area, I would pick, first of all, on the mishmash of restrictions on international travel, and look at ways to coordinate these better. Now, pandemic-related travel restrictions are probably going to be one of the last things that is removed, given that different countries are at different positions in the way in which and the level at which they've tackled the pandemic. And it's clearly by coordinating them better, we can both improve their effectiveness, but also reduce their costs. Some countries may well need financial assistance in order to put good practices in place. And what I would do is highlight that, you know, we've done this before in the G20 and in other summit process in the way we've handled counterterrorism restrictions on travel. And I can't really see why, if we can do it for counterterrorism, we can't do it in this area as well. Both of these require a high level of trust. The second area is, as was highlighted in some of the opening remarks, strengthening global financial support for public health measures. This may partly need to focus on the question of vaccine distribution, which depends to some extent on how the existing initiatives work. But I think it goes very much broader than that. And public health is an area, global public health is an area of overwhelming interest. So in a sense, once you have the spirit, you'll have movement behind that. My second category of measures is looking at the longer term legacy of the pandemic. And here I would pick out 2 things in particular. First, debt sustainability, particularly sovereign debt sustainability in emerging economies, but also the question of corporate indebtedness. And this is very much the landing point for all the liquidity measures that have been taken at national level over the past 6 months. And there are a number of steps one can take to try and get debt sustainability on a better track. On the one hand is cooperation that boosts revenues, and in particular, if the OECD work on taxing the digital economy isn't complete at the end of this year, which I think is unlikely, that would be a key area to focus on. But there may also be things that countries can do by working together to improve the sustainability of sovereign debt, including through the issuance of new types of financial instruments. There may be need for debt restructuring. And I think in the corporate sector, it may well be possible to look at the question of the debt versus equity balance in global companies more generally. We've moved very much towards debt, and yet that is one of the things that's reducing resilience. There may be a number of measures, if internationally coordinated, that could move us back towards a greater focus on equity. Moving on very quickly, a further area in the sort of medium term is in supply chain resilience. I think this is very well understood that the solution is not to pull back from diversification or to retrench. And there are clearly things that one can do by cooperating, which will make it easier for companies, for big multinational companies, to support big multinational companies in improving supply chain resilience in the future. My third category is steps to capitalize on the opportunities that COVID has illustrated for us. And obviously the most important one is in the area of new technology, where the world has had a crash course in new technology. And we've seen that you can improve the quality of life and indeed improve sustainability. But it's very important to put in place the safeguards that enable this to happen. So for example, the kind of measures that we're seeing in some European countries around labor market protections to enable people to work from home, an example of what can be done there. Similarly, in the trade track, pushing forward measures on e-commerce is another very important area in order to capture the benefits from what we've learned during the course of the crisis. And then finally, my fourth area is going back to my point at the start about uncertainty. I think it's really important that the world develops a new, broader global resilience framework, which takes on board issues like the pandemic, but also climate change and many other things. And I think it's would be very helpful for the Italian presidency to start the sort of thinking about what global resilience really involves and where cooperation can make a difference and enable us all to deal with this very uncertain world and what may well prove to be the kind of high frequency, high impact shocks of the future. Finally, just to say, I mean, I realize the Saudi presidency has tackled a number of these issues already and has made some progress, but I think it's really important to keep pushing on them. And then finally, the Italian G20 is being held in the context of other major multilateral events, not least the UK G7, probably a WTO ministerial, COP26. And on many of these, there is actually a real opportunity for cooperation between the UK and Italy, not least because the COP26 is a joint exercise between the two countries. So I think the more that can be done to create a common momentum across those different summits, the more effective it will be. So thank you very much.
Many thanks, Mr. Paolo, for all these very incisive suggestions. And now the floor goes to Andrei Vitrisky, chairman of the Valdai Club Foundation in Moscow.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great honor for me and for our Valdai Club, the Russian think tank. And I would like to start citing of last encyclical of the Pope. In an encyclical, Francis lamented poor cooperation among countries and warned the forces of myopic, extremist, resentful, and aggressive nationalism are on the rise. It's a very nice encyclical, but we see serious crisis of unity, of cooperation, of coordination, our efforts, and so on and so on. And it seems to me that G20 probably, of course, it's not prototype of world government, fortunately or unfortunately, but we need more cooperation, we need more mutual understanding and coordinated efforts. I think, due to shortage of time, I think I don't need to explain the situation about our ideas. Amid the pandemic, the concept of global risk society has taken prominence. In fact, against the backdrop of climate change, epidemics and pandemics, and other natural and man-made disasters, the global risk society could well be regarded as a real alternative to the existing concept of globalization. Therefore, understanding how new risks affect on the global political system and the evolution of the world order is essential. The transform strategic planning into global risk planning. We should think about how to adapt the existing institutions and practices so that they become capable of reacting to planet-scale risk in an adequate manner. There is a problem of cooperation that that level of our interdependence is growing, but our ability to regulate this process, to find new regulation form, isn't growing. In fact, it's a big problem. We should think more about cooperation, mutual understanding, and creation of institution for solving these problems. The second point, the world economy has been hit hard by pandemic, highlighting the lack of financial mechanisms addressing long-term vulnerabilities, including the undersupply of healthcare services on a global scale. The ways of countering the global economic slowdown through coordinated measures have been discussed in the expert community recently, but we believe it is high time to take the issue to the top level. In recent years, the Valdai Club had advocated creating, under the G20 auspices, permanent mechanisms to elevate the aftermath of economic crisis, in particular by implementing a coordinated fiscal stimuli. Such coordinated fiscal stimuli across the G20 economies should improve upon the 2010-2009 experience through focusing more on the composition of fiscal spending with greater priority according to human capital development, most notably healthcare. The effect of such mechanisms could be amplified by cooperation with regional integration organizations and regional development banks, which we suggest to explore as a part of the T20 process in 2021. And the third, the COVID pandemic dealt a blow not only the state of the world economy, but to its most important asset, namely human capital. In particular, one of the most significant implications of the COVID pandemic has been sizable shock delivered to migration flows and the related flows of remittances. It's very interesting, but today Kyrgyzstan crisis is related to this problem directly because COVID and problems with coordination. Anyway, it's very important. The drastic reduction in the size of remittances exacerbates the imbalances observed in the global economy associated with the gap between developed and developing economies. Okay, this is very short, and this is it's some aspects of our ideas about future cooperation. Of course, there are a lot of more problems, and now we see the problems in education, in digitalization, in technology and inequality, a lot of problems. But there is, finally, a short joke. There is, this joke is circulating in Russia, of course. This year, 2020, is a trailer of next year, 2021. And, you know, in 3 months is New Year. And somebody was asked, what will you ask Santa Claus in next year? I will beg for mercy him. Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.
Many thanks, Dr. Bitrisky. Now the floor goes to Sakin Chitervidi, Director General of the Research Information System for Developing Countries. I apologize because I failed to mention that he's also a member of the board of the Central Bank of India. So you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Professor Greco, and thanks to IAI for this opportunity. It's a great pleasure to join you here to discuss, and I'm very much thankful to the President today to spell out some of the priorities as the thought processes are evolving. Friends, as you would realize, in last 20 years, the G20 has come up and almost 12 years of the Leaders Summit has come up with several ideas around global governance, global public goods, international monetary and financial stability measures, and have come up with diverse and varied responses in terms of how we go forward. And I'm sure the Italian presidency would, of course, bring in their own national experience and EU-specific priorities, but would also bring in the dimensions that are extremely important for the institutions and for the wider engagement that is necessary. I find it also extremely interesting to note that most of the presidencies, if you see in last couple of years, have given a sort of continuity to the agenda and issues that have come up. And each time they have been adding up to new issues that are there. And Saudi presidency is very much an evident and very vibrant example of this. As we heard Dr. Al-Mutari, she explained how the task forces on COVID-19, they were added at the last moment. And I think that's what reflects the sort of vibrancy that the presidencies provide. The Italian presidency is coming at a historical moment. I would say it's an extraordinary moment in terms of how the response, the global response to COVID-19 as it was unfolding in the Saudi presidency time, but the response and the resurrection, the regeneration of the several measures, I think would be extremely important in Italian presidency, followed by Indian presidency. So these two presidencies are coming at a moment when the global economy and the wider global community is looking for the kind of response that is needed collectively by this platform. And I think there are several measures that have been initiated in the past that require to be pushed in. I have 5 points to make, and I would be very quick. First and foremost, I think the very development approach, the very development paradigm, I think that we require to take forward probably is something that we should revisit. The endogeneity within the development process, I think, is absolutely essential and important, and that should be sort of revisited from our perspectives on the sustainable development goals, the efforts that we require for an inclusive global order. We need to bring everyone on board, and I'm glad that the German presidency had added Africa as a focus area, as an outreach, and I think we need to continue that. Subsequent presidencies have made, Argentinian presidency particularly made effort to carry that forward, and I think it's important that we focus and bring all regions in one sort of effort. So that's my point number one. Here also the important issue would be to reduce the resource intensity of development. So the European experience or the Anglo-Saxon experience on development cannot be repeated, and we would have to be sensitive towards that. So that's my first point. Second is, of course, to re-emphasize, and I think Italian presidency is rightly placed to do so, is to re-emphasize and identify task forces in a way so that we re-emphasize international cooperation and partnership. The role cannot be emphasized more. The time has come that we revisit those institutions that are there to propel the idea of international cooperation and partnership. Unless we do that, we cannot move forward. My third point is about finance and economy track. I'm glad that from Dr. Butler, we heard about the debt, and I would say that the Saudi presidency did respond to this, but it is important that we re-emphasize all participative global response on debt. Some countries going completely out of the global bloc probably may not help everyone. So it is important that we collectively respond to the debt crisis, which in post-COVID-19 would be building up and would be coming up with major sort of catastrophes by the next presidency when Italy is there in chair. The second point, and I'm very glad that the president has today mentioned about trade digitalization. I think we also need to bring cross-border services into this, and we can move forward. The third point within finance and economy is protecting the supply chains and trying to see that the autonomy and independence is retained, and we take measures that are required. And associated with that is the global fintech development and its governance part. So that's the second point. The third point is about technology, and I think technology should bring in the principles of access, equity, and inclusion. EU has been talking about some of these measures, and I think it's important that the governance part with technology comes up in a major way. India and South Africa have submitted a major paper to WTO recently talking about the post-COVID-19 access to vaccine. And I think the IPR regime, the intellectual property regime that is required to be addressed is absolutely important from multilateral institutional perspective, and we need to go forward. Associated point is about the health and technology connect, and that I think would be extremely important. My last point is about development finance and how we bring in governance of it, the triangular cooperation that is needed to take that forward, particularly the OECD DAC and the South-South cooperation, these two coming together at the G20 platform to see how development finance can be consolidated and extended to support the larger processes that are there. I would stop here, Dr. Greco. Thank you.
Many thanks, Mr. Cidervidi. Now I have the great pleasure to give the floor to Dennis Gerlich, Head of Global Challenge Center at the Kiel Institute.
Good morning, everyone. Well, I think I must say a lot of the things I wanted to mention in my talk have already been mentioned by several of you, which is not surprising. So I think what the COVID pandemic obviously has done is it has put a spotlight on how interdependent the world has become, and also I think how fragile many of the achievements that we've had are in fact, right? One point I think that has not been clearly mentioned, but which I think is important, is that we see that trust among countries, countries that were formerly partners, has been eroded quite strongly sometimes through the COVID crisis. International cooperation was increasingly questioned during the emergency phases of the pandemic. Inequalities increased all around the world, and well, this comes basically on top, I think, of what we have seen before, namely that the multilateral cooperation was under fire. Nationalism has been emerging in many countries, trade conflicts, all these issues, probably because people no longer really believed in the type of globalization that we, and also importantly the G20, have promoted throughout the last 10, 12 years of its existence. And probably rightly so, because it increased inequalities in many levels. And we increasingly saw that the governance architecture that we had doesn't really fit the interdependencies of our economies anymore. And we see that new economic powers have emerged, and we have a new kind of digital world that is largely ungoverned in many areas, and where there's really no global consensus on many issues, how this governance should look like and how we exchange data, for example, how we deal with services trade that has been increasing before COVID and also during the COVID crisis, of course. So what I think we have to address, and the Italian presidency has to address during the G20 term, is to kind of shape a world that is better prepared for, let's say, the new world with digital trade, data transfers, and many people being very skeptical of globalization or even hyper-globalization as we have seen it in many years before. And secondly, a world with emergencies, like be better prepared for emergencies like pandemics, and also, of course, climate change, which I would also consider such an emergency. So the question is the G20 the right forum to shape this kind of world? And I think, yes, it is. And this is why we're here, because I think we all believe in this. And I would just mention briefly a few points from a policy brief that me and a colleague of mine have written for the T20 Saudi Arabia, for the task force on multilateralism. And we have basically looked at the G20 and the past years of its existence, the 12 years of its existence, and tried to kind of look at the special features of the G20 and why it is such an important forum for making such large-scale changes in shaping a new world, for example, in terms of the points I've made before. And what we've looked at in particular are what we call the fields of action that the G20 can play on. And we think basically that the G20 can do three things. First, it can be a supplier of what we call top-level political impetus, and I'll talk about more in a second what this is. The second is that the G20 can be considered a norm setter. And the third one is that the G20 can be considered a policy initiator. And let me explain what I mean by this. So we think that the G20 has shown in the past that it can really supply top-level political impetus, meaning that it can support, for example, the coming together of global agreements. The Basel III agreement in financial markets regulation, and also the Paris climate agreement has probably come together also because the G20 has supplied some real top-level impetus with 20 of the most important, powerful countries in the world putting their weight behind these agreements and doing that officially in their G20 communications. We've seen support for reforms of international institutions in many aspects. It also helps to kind of prioritize certain problems. This is something that the G20 can do in their communiques. And what it means, I think, for the post-COVID world is that what the G20 should probably do is emphasize the resilience agenda And also it should emphasize probably how we can manage the digital transformation at a global level. So how we can manage those issues on a global level that need to be done at the global level. So for example, manage data transfers and these issues. So the second point I've mentioned is the norm setting capacity. The G20 can decide on joint principles. For example, there has been a standstill agreement on protectionism after the financial crisis, agreement on macroprudential policies to be carried out. And in that regard, the G20 can agree on certain things that they consider important, and this will then be reflected in many policies that national economies and policymakers in fact implement. The third one is it can initiate policies, and what I mean there is that the G20 has some delegative quality. While it cannot, of course, implement policies itself, it can delegate some things: fiscal stimulus packages, the 25 by 25 agenda for gender equity, the BEPS initiative, and the artificial intelligence principle that have been agreed on. And in that regard, it can really push countries to implement some important policies that have been agreed globally on a G20 level. So I think here these points kind of make clear why the G20 has an important role in shaping this kind of new world, digital world, and also one that is prepared for emergencies. But of course, the range of fields that the G20 addresses is really broad. I would just like to mention here, because one of my roles is for the Global Solutions Initiative. We have, in fact, put together a website that I would encourage you to look at, where we feature what we call global tables, which consist of speeches, panels, literature, addressing all these broad number of issues that the G20 can address and should address, and also addresses the post-COVID world in all G20 policy areas. And we offer this website really as a resource and platform to exchange ideas, to exchange new research for the G20. And we also see it as a support for the T20 work, as a platform for exchange and leveraging dissemination. So we have put together a lot of things there that can hopefully be informative to many of you in shaping this G20 agenda for the upcoming year, and also beyond that for India.
So many thanks again, Mr. Gerlich. And I have now the pleasure to inform you that Ambassador Pietro Benassi has joined us. Many thanks again, Ambassador Benassi. But now we will follow the list of the speaker, and the floor goes, as announced, to Elizabeth Sidiropoulos, Chief Executive of the South African Institute of International Affairs.
Thank you. Firstly, just to say that I think a lot of the points that are important for Africa, because I'm going to be speaking from an African perspective, I think have already been touched on by some of my colleagues. But let me then quickly highlight a couple of points, both in the context in terms of making some general observations around multilateralism, but then also focusing on a couple of specific points, some of which have already been touched on. I think it's obviously important to note that when we're discussing the importance of reviving multilateralism, that while developing countries see the value of multilateralism and I think are committed multilateralists, it's also important to recognize that many of the rules and the values require a change. And this may be stating the obvious, but I think it is important. And when Dennis was speaking about the importance of the G20 as setting norms and initiating policies, I think that's an important point to bear in mind. The second is that we are much more globally, we're a much more heterogeneous world in our economic and developmental models than we were even 40 years ago. But the global rules reflect a particular dominant perspective, even as countries that made the rules are shifting away from some of this dominant perspective. And I think the debates around global economic models and globalization, I think, are part of that observation. Third, clearly groupings such as the G20 can act to help break deadlocks, initiate changes to rules, all the points that Dennis was making, and try to build consensus among the membership that can actually bring significant weight to bear in moving some of these processes forward, also reforming mindsets. The challenge, I think, for the Italian presidency in 2021 is how to adopt a pragmatic approach about what can be achieved by bodies such as the G20 in 1 year, in a year that is also fraught by the consequences of COVID-19. And critically, how do we reinforce multilateralism and identify which institutions we currently have we can actually work to improve their ability to function, whether we're talking specifically about the WTO, which was one of the issues that the president outlined right at the beginning, or an institution like the WHO. I think, and we need to think about what are the low-hanging fruits in that regard. But here, let me come quickly to issues that are directly relevant and critical to Africa. While from a health perspective, the COVID pandemic hasn't caused the dire consequences many feared, African economies have been impacted by the global lockdown, especially many of the commodity exporters. In my own country, unemployment, which was already high, is probably sitting at about 40% at the moment, with women affected disproportionately, and we need to think about that dimension as well. Concerns have been voiced about the reversal of developmental gains that have been made in the last decade. And as many African economies were able to diversify their financing options over the last period, including in bond markets, going out into capital markets and so on, COVID has now compounded some of the debt problems that were appearing on the horizon and that certain countries were facing. But at the same time, I think if we're talking about regions that have been able to respond effectively to the COVID pandemic and cooperate, I think African countries have really been among the quickest to mobilize continentally and to coordinate. And there are lessons, I think, there for other parts of the world and for how we mobilize to generate greater support for cooperation, whether it was around the initiative that they took to push for debt standstill, initiative to establish common procurement platforms for medicines, establishment of a COVID solidarity fund to which many G20 countries have in fact contributed. And so these are all important lessons in terms of how we also tell the narrative of cooperation in the time of the pandemic. I think it is important, and certainly this is a debate happening on the continent at the moment, that hyper-globalization needs to be rethought, that the steep financing mountain to achieve the SDGs, which now becomes even more critical, is even steeper, and that the current financing models are not sufficient, that we need to contribute and invest to global public goods, and that international coordination is the way to do it. So, two issues, one of which has been mentioned, and that's debt. The second one, which hasn't, which is that of dealing decisively with illicit financial flows. The recent UNCTAD report, which highlights that nearly 89%, 89 billion of illicit financial flows flow out of Africa a year. This is the estimated financing gap to deal with the socioeconomic costs of COVID are about $200 billion annually. And this is in addition to the emergency health spending. So plugging this IFF gap is a significant contribution to actually helping African countries build up a fiscal space. This is a fraught issue. It's been on the agenda for a long time. South Africa has been a long advocated for this issue to be tackled. A couple of years ago, a report was tabled, was commissioned by the Development Working Group on trade misinvoicing and tabled at the G20 Development Working Group. It wasn't discussed, certainly. I know that there was a recent meeting of the working group a couple of weeks ago, but this needs really to be taken on board by the Italian presidency and also tabled in the finance track, which I think is critical. And then the second point relates to debt. The DSSI, which runs until the end of the year, there is a discussion during this month of a possible extension of it. I think that is going to be critical. And I think while we also need to think about how, while some new creditors have signed on to the G20, agreement, there hasn't been much movement on that. How do we facilitate that movement as a G20 body? And what do we do about private creditors? There is also the concern around really engaging constructively with credit rating agencies, because many countries don't want to take up the DSSI because of what that might mean for credit rating, for their credit rating. And I think we really need to rethink that entire model around debt, and dealing also, I think Creon raised that, how we deal with sovereign debt restructuring. Lastly, let me make the points about the trade agenda and supply chains. These are extremely critical for an Africa that is only now, I think, trying to get its act together in terms of also building up regional value chains and supply chains. And I think the COVID does provide these opportunities. And so how we engage on many of these issues, including some of the issues around a digital commerce, which Sachin alluded to, and the proposals made before the WTO are critical. Lastly, we do need to do things differently. Building back better is also about a paradigm shift. And I think the G20 and the role that it can play in a critical time in 2021, I think creates an opportunity for the Italian presidency to begin tackling some of these bigger normative issues in terms of the kind of global economy that we need to be focusing on. Thank you.
Many, many thanks. I think our panelists have provided us with several very incisive, thought-provoking proposals and suggestions on specific points of the G20 agenda, also offering insightful regional perspectives and discussing particularly the potential added value of the G20 in this new situation. Of course, any presidency is always faced with the dilemma on how to assure continuity with initiatives launched and taken by the previous presidencies, but also what type of new initiatives can be undertaken, taking into account, of course, that the agenda should be updated continuously and renewed. And in the roundtable, indeed, we have been able to cover several issues and policy sector, including environment, development cooperation, finance, trade, etc. So I think now we are all looking forward to the speech by Ambassador Benassi, diplomatic advisor to the Italian Prime Minister G20 Sherpa, whom I would like, on behalf of our institute, to thank for his support and support of his group in conducting this research. Please, Ambassador Benassi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank Ferdinando Nelli Feroci, the President Profumo, and overall, I would like to thank the International Affairs Institute for this invitation. The present crisis, as everybody knows, is unprecedented in its scale, magnitude, and reach, but it offers opportunity to catalyze positive changes. So while recognizing, according to our view, that the pandemic is not over, we think that it is our duty to look beyond the immediate crisis, so that we think that it's in our hands to emerge from this emergency in a better way. And this is the right moment to say that, because of this unfortunate second wave that we are experiencing, especially in Europe. So while recognize the pandemic is not over, it is our duty to look beyond the immediate crisis. It is for that reason I said that. For that reason, we are working intensely, as we are aware of the role that we can play as Italian government, but of course, as Italian civil society, that for the next coming year, for this presidency of the G20, we have to lead the multilateral efforts needed to shape a better future for our citizens and the global society. Italy, in our preparing work, is shaping an agenda that will hinge on 3P, people, planet, and prosperity. And this means taking care of people and the planet in a holistic fashion. So that I would like to stress how this agenda and the attached priorities resonate the strategy to which the Italian government is committed on a national level, and the spirit that inspires both the European New Green Deal and the European vision embodied in the Next Generation EU. As far as people is concerned, we think that we have to build back better. All our policy actions have to be centered around people. This means tackling inequality, better endow every part of the society with equal opportunities. Among the concrete deliverables in this first pillar, we would like to progress further the work carried out by B20 on an international passport to facilitate the access of MSMEs to trade finance in foreign countries. What I would like to say from at the very beginning is the fact that due to the international situation, the pandemic is not over, and other elements which are not going to facilitate our work, we would like to be extremely pragmatic in the number of deliverables, and we will try to present only the deliverables that we are convinced we have the possibility to reach. As I said, this first deliverable is a kind of passport which has to ensure that requirements for operating in the global value chain are met only once in one participating country, and will avoid the burden of having to reapply multiple times across borders. This initiative has the potential to reduce bureaucracy, which is a major challenge we are facing in our own country due to requirements requested by the Next Generation EU. And with this parcel, we want to eliminate unnecessary red tape while increasing transparency and traceability, as well as facilitate access to wider markets, above all for small businesses. Trade is important to protect and enable in our vision, also when it comes to health care. This is a new entry in our discussion, but we want to stress as much as we can this element. For this reason, we wish to continue the work carried out by the Saudi presidency to avoid any kind of a restriction for medical supplies and healthcare products, endorsing the idea of an international initiative to facilitate this specific kind of international trade. And we get a certain experience as Italian government just at the very beginning of the pandemic during the month of March. So we have to avoid any restriction for medical supplies. This is a major element that we want to stress in our agenda. Second, the role of women, social protection and digitalization will be pivotal as well. We are thinking about fostering a dialogue to draft a roadmap to concretely help governments in pursuing the Brisbane goal and ensure that this deep economic crisis does not affect women disproportionately. Women played a very important role in our country during the highest level of pandemic, especially in tourism and healthcare section, but their role in the managing these two elements were not as much important as it was their role in helping our society. The multilateral dialogue should be strengthened also on social protection in an era of deep and structural changes, above all in the energy sector. This could lead to joint policy options recommendations aimed at improving the link between social support measures and active policy interventions. In this spirit, we deem it important to focus also on the social consequences of the digital revolution, spurring multilateral proposal towards the identification of basic principles for the regulation of platform and smart work. As far as the planet is concerned, we think that this second pillar hinges on the urgent need to acknowledge that our planet is facing long-term crisis rooted in a number of interconnected global challenges. Developing a safer and more sustainable world requires restoring the balance between people and nature And in this sense, we must admit that our commitments to the Paris Agreement and the SDGs can no longer be postponed since the cost of inaction is increasing. Moreover, in our opinion, the pandemic has shown the importance of making the urban environment healthier. The urban dimension is a pivotal role in both the achievement of SDGs and the turn towards a more sustainable world. For this reason, we want the G20 next year to concentrate its efforts on concepts such as urban reforestation, sustainable mobility, renovation of buildings, and the energetic future of our cities, the so-called smart cities. Along these lines, we think that renewable energies and hydrogen from renewable sources are of paramount importance, as also smart grids are. The digitalization of the electric grids is a fundamental step to reduce emissions and enhance their productivity and efficiency. Furthermore, we believe that circular economy is key to achieve a more sustainable way of living. We want to propose a concept on circular economy to promote a common understanding of what a circular economy is in order to channel efforts, investment, and expertise in the right direction. Our strong commitment to build a more sustainable society will be reinforced by our partnership with the United Kingdom in promoting a successful COP26, collaboration that will help also to make the most of the mutual synergies with the UK presidency of G7 together in 2021. As far as prosperity is concerned, we think the digital revolution is a fundamental tool to achieve prosperity and better quality of life, but for too long, digitalization has been an engine of precariousness and inequality. We want to spur the international community to work to make digitalization an opportunity for all. We are thinking of launching a dialogue for a sustainable artificial intelligence aimed at proposing shared principles to shape an international code of ethics and conduct, continuing further to the Osaka G20 AI principles. In the finance track, we are working to make digital infrastructures an opportunity for social inclusion, guaranteeing in this sense a universal internet access. Moreover, considering the aging trend of many G20 countries, even the Italian one, of course, we should foster the use of digitalization to reduce the burden of an aging society on the public finances and to better include elders in the society, enhancing their positive contribution. The importance of digitalization has been enhanced by the crisis we have been through, which represent a catalyst. Increased smart work and flexible working models may contribute to redistributing unpaid care work between genders, which disproportionately affects women, as well as to promote a better work-life balance for both men and women. So, ending my introduction in this agenda, I would say that the challenges in front of us are daunting but crucial to define our common future. Governments must show determination, vision, and courage, but we need civil society's engagement. We have to work together. It is in our hands to emerge from this emergency in a better way. Let's not get back to normality. Let's shape a new, better, greener, more sustainable and more inclusive normality to live in.
Many thanks for your speech, which has been very enlightening, and for all those indications and also responses to some of the issues that indeed we have discussed during the round table. And I I am now going to open up, but if I may, I would like to use my privilege as chairman to ask two first questions to you, Ambassador Benassi. First, of course, we need a huge infrastructure investment, in particular to support the transition to a greener and more sustainable economy. This is a subject that we have covered quite extensively in this meeting. And so what do you think the G20 should do in order to enhance infrastructure investment? And second question, which has also been discussed during the roundtable, do you think there should be a special geographical focus in the agenda of the G20, particularly taking into account the specific challenges of the post-COVID-19 situation?
Yes. Well, okay, thank you for this question. The first one especially is an active policy debate point in our country, just in front of the requirements needed from the next generation EU. But as far as the international scenario is concerned, in order to concretely achieve, in our opinion, a greener, more sustainable global society, it will be crucial, extremely crucial, to channel public and private investment in the right direction. Renewing our infrastructure stock is urgent and offers a productive use to idle private and public funds, spurring demand in the short run, and above all, enhancing productivity and sustainability in the long run. Despite the green economy could represent, as far as I know, 10% of global market capitalization by 2030, today there are yet a number of barriers limiting the development and diffusion of cleaner technologies and the business opportunities associated with the green transition in turn. The G20 has a clear role to play in fostering innovation for the green transition and enhancing the associated business opportunities. As suggested already by the B20, the G20 countries should strengthen their cooperative effort to reduce market fragmentation and promote a level playing field, encouraging policy convergence on environmental issues and the harmonization of standards. This will make easier and more profitable for the private sector to invest in cleaner infrastructure. Making our societies more sustainable is no longer an option, it is our duty. And it has to be clear that it's an economic opportunity and not an economic cost, because if it is framed correctly, recovery efforts will give countries a chance to integrate much needed environmental improvements into the economic recovery, rather than such measures being perceived as an additional burden at the time of a crisis. We strongly endorse, in the post-pandemic recovery measures, the provision of stimulus to create widespread long-lasting opportunities, jobs and infrastructure in the low-zero carbon energy transition. As far as the geographical focus is concerned, all the issues that we discussed are global in their nature. Nonetheless, we firmly believe that G20 should carefully consider the impact of the crisis on the most vulnerable countries, above all in the African continent. We should act to safeguard the human lives in a context where health systems are less equipped and ensure the stability of economic systems. Let us be frank, no state and no region can win the battle against COVID-19 alone. If the virus is not beaten and eradicated also in the most vulnerable regions like Africa, it will return to haunt us all. In this spirit, Italy joined the G20 debt service suspension initiative, and we stand ready to consider a further enlargement of the initiative towards the low-income countries. Moreover, we believe that financing for development and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda are paramount to promote a sustainable future beyond COVID-19. We must strengthen all our financing tools, maximize their impact, and ensure that our investments and policies leave no one behind. Also, when it comes to vaccines, the G20 should work to guarantee a universal and equitable access to vaccines to everybody. There is no other viable solution. I hope to have answer to your question.
Absolutely. Many thanks, Ambassador Benassi. Now the floor is open for questions, comments. It seems that contrary to what I said at the beginning of the seminar, there is no raise of hand button active. So I like, yes, I see already a hand. Please, I think the first is now Mr. Butler.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Ambassador Benassi. I think you've set out a very comprehensive and well-balanced program, and clearly that is the basis for a successful G20 presidency. But as you know, you're kind of coming on top of a period when international cooperation has been extraordinarily difficult. And in a sense, there may be things that happen next year that make it a bit easier, but equally, you know, there are things that you can do, I guess, in the area of rebuilding trust, rebuilding the habit of international cooperation. And I just wonder if you could say a little bit about how you want to approach that enormous challenge, both in terms of the success of your own presidency, but also setting a path for restoring, if you like, the G20 to the role that it played 10 years ago. Thank you.
As a matter of fact, multilateralism is not in its best shape in the last years, so we all are aware of that. But we are also aware that any alternative to multilateralism is a defeat for everybody. So I don't want to say that independently for the shape of the multilateralism, we have to fight for a better and effective multilateralism. We have to consider this shape, but we have to take into consideration just to maintain what is possible to maintain of multilateralism. Let's take as an example the two major pillars that historically are discussed at the G20 level, climate change and trade. What do we think we can do without a multilateralism approach to these major pillars if we are not acting multilaterally? We are going to be defeated, everybody, without any possibility to recover. So what we can do in multilateral way, we will do. And we will take also consciously what is the world around us. But okay, let's think positive, because I believe to self-fulfilling prophecy also in negative, and I think that the work of a diplomat is like the stock exchange. I know that somehow some positive feeling don't give positive results, but I never ever witnessed in the history that negative feeling could give positive results. So let's maintain and think positively, and let's work for a good multilateralism, and the balance we will draw at the end of the story.
So many thanks.
Can I ask?
Just one question.
Yes, please. Yes, please.
I'm Sachin Chaturvedi here from RIS in New Delhi. Ambassador Benassi, I wanted to ask you, India would be taking over immediately after the Italian presidency, and the Troika would be operational in a month's time. How you see this continuity coming up, given the fact that The pandemic has adversely affected economies across the North and the South, and the cooperation that is needed, as you very rightly said, is not confined to the health sector alone. And I'm very glad and thankful to you for recognizing the role that MSMEs can play in reviving these economies where the scale and scope for operation has got extremely constrained. Thank you.
Thanks. Are there any other questions or comments?
Just one question, short one.
Please.
Thank you much for your speech. And one question: what do you think about vaccination? And you have mentioned vaccination and vaccine. What's about our mutual recognition of vaccine? Because there are a lot of vaccine in the world. What kind of vaccine should we use? What shall we do with numbers of vaccine? What do you think about it? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yes, please. I see if I'm right, Dennis.
Yes. I would like to mention once more the field of digital governance. And so what I think we observe currently is that the digital world, digital services trade, which is on the one hand becoming more important, but on the other hand, it's a field that's largely ungoverned in international treaties. Certainly by the WTO, while we see some discussion of this in regional trade agreements, there's, I think, a major point in getting a global discussion on this going. We see very different regimes of how to handle data. The United States with a very business-centered approach, the Europeans with an approach that's very focused on protecting privacy, and the Chinese approach, which is basically an internet cutoff from the world internet, where they develop their own companies, and also where it's unclear who can actually access data that's going into that sphere. So do you see, Ambassador Benassi, a chance to get these discussions going on a G20 level? And how should we approach these issues? And how should we get this going to have an approach at the global level on these, I think, important issues that are becoming even more important now that we do not travel as much anymore in the current pandemic, and I'd be interested in your view on that.
Thanks, Dennis. Indeed, you underline the potential norm-setting role of G20 in your speech during the roundtable, but also Ambassador Benassi mentioned that there will be an attempt by the presidency to launch a specific initiative. So perhaps the ambassador would like to elaborate a little bit on that, although we are just at the beginning. So any other questions or comments? Unless there are no other questions, I have the pleasure now to give the floor to Ambassador Benassi, please, for his reply.
Thank you very much. Well, as far as the first question is concerned, we are extremely glad that we have this continuity with India for the G20 exercise, also because a geographic alternance which could help. Second, for the fact that India, as a matter of fact, is not a country, it's quite a continent. So due to the importance and the dimension of India, we can exchange useful information and useful way of working that we will share, of course, from the very beginning of our presidency, not only because of Troika system, but also because we believe and we are extremely aware of the fact that make good experiences in exchanges, sensibilities, and working with India is a good starting point to get more important results for the future. So welcome to this kind of alternate in the position of a G20 presidency, you can count on us from the very first day of our chairmanship. The second element on vaccines, as you know, and I told just at the end of my intervention, just answering to your second question, Ettore, to the fact that G20 should work to guarantee a universal and equitable access to vaccines to everybody. There is no other viable solution. Italy so far took part to the most important initiative at international level, both financially, both entering into certain pool of companies and other government's part, as its last coalition together with Oxford University, the Italian company IBRM, the AstraZeneca, which is one of the most important pool in order to get a vaccine, but we participate also to many international activities to finance not only the research, but the distribution, the equitable distribution to the vaccines to everybody. So we will do our work. I don't know if G20 is going to be decisive on that, but G20 has the duty to give a strong contribution on that. First, on political awareness of the need to be effective on that, and second, for the fact that the 20 most important economies in the world, they have a preeminent role in order to give their contribution. As far as the third question, which is a key element for the future, but also for present days, the data management, Mr. Gerlich summarized very well the fact, the three important school of thought in this very moment in the planet, USA, Europe, China. As a European, not only as presidency of the G20, we believe in the fact that, okay, we have the data and privacy and personal protection as a pillar in our European culture, but we have a second pillar in our European culture, and as a European, together other member states of the European Union, we will try to give our contribution during the G20 exercise, which is Europe, in our opinion, is called to facilitate a positive agenda on that, because if we want to look and to find the negative elements in this agenda, we have millions of examples, but we have to concentrate on positive agenda, on this data management debate, also to ease and facilitate a better dialogue with the other two main actors of this important element for the discussion for the months and the years to come. So what I think that we have an enormous element from one side to build up an agenda in which we can have mutual benefit elements for everybody. And the second element, we don't have to forget that also data management, which has security consequences, defense consequences, economic consequence, all the possible strategic consequences that you can see on them. As I said before, this is another element that must give us the awareness that we have to fight inequalities. So we have to discuss this element, bearing in our mind that digitalization, as we experience so far, produced inequalities. We have to smooth this negative effect in order, hopefully, in the short run, to cancel it. But at least we have to weaken this inequality effect of digitalization.
So many thanks, Ambassador Benassi, for this indeed very stimulating, interesting responses, for giving us such a comprehensive picture of the first elements, let's say, of the Italian the program of Italian presidency of the G20. We as the Institute very much look forward to working with the G20 Sherpa group, and you personally, if in view of the activities that we are planning to conduct, especially next year, and especially in the context of the T20, which is the network of the Institute I mentioned at the beginning of the seminar. So we certainly will continue to make major efforts to involve our partner institutes and leading experts with whom we have cooperated on a regular basis on global governance in the last few years, and particularly on G20, G7 presidency. So I now, thanks again, Ambassador Benassi. Now the pleasure to give the floor to Paola Subacchi. Is the professor at the Queen Mary University, but also I'd like to underline she's a member of the Institute board. Please, Paola, you have the floor.
Thank you, and Ambassador Benassi, Ambassador Nelly Ferrocci, Ettore, friends and colleagues, so thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. I have a very difficult task. I need to summarize the richness of today's discussion in a few minutes, just before lunch in Rome kicks in. So I will be brief, and I take a few points. I will start with what Ambassador Nelly Ferrocci mentioned as a G20 responsibilities, and to make international cooperation matter, and what many participants talks about paradigm shift and being better prepared for the post-COVID world. And so this is very much a challenging agenda for the G20. But what is the G20 for? It's, again, we heard it today, it's there to maintain and preserve international cooperation, and for the provision and the preservation of international public goods. And these are financial stability, for example, and that was the core of the G20 at the time of the global financial crisis, but also environmental sustainability, sustainable growth, and down to now our days to global health, which is a public good. Unfortunately, the G20 has always been has always faced this dilemma between the short-term crisis, and the last 12 years have been punctuated with many different crises, and the short-term and the long-term mission. And I think we need to be careful then fighting the crisis, resolving the crisis doesn't somehow put aside the very important long-term mission of the G20, which is creating stability and resilience. In other words, preventing crisis. And to some extent, the G20 has never been able to emerge from a crisis committee dimension into a really a proper international group for the stability of the global economy and the world as a whole. So I think the Italian presidency has a great responsibility to refund the G20, to create stronger foundation for the G20. And I think 2021 will be a key year for rethinking this long-term mission for the G20, and generally the role and the importance of multilateral cooperation. So this is a great challenge for the Italian team and the Italian G20, and I'm sure Italy will be up to the task, and Italy is the perfect country to really somehow rebuild trust in the multilateral dialogue. Of course, a lot depends on what will happen next month in the US election, because obviously the US is an important and a critical participant to the G20 and somehow holds the key to the G20 success. But I'm sure that the Italians will do extremely well next year. So if I think about the long-term mission of the G20, I will summarize in 4 points, and which are a more orderly and secure world, including secure from a health point of view, a more prosperous world, a greener world, and a more diverse world. And so the Italian presidency in this overview of the agenda summarized this in the 3 P: people, prosperity, and the planet. How do we do this? Here, I don't think there is only an embarrassment of riches, so many recommendations, all very good. And I'm sure that the T20 will continue to provide important inputs for the agenda. I think I picked just one, which is very dear to me and which emerged in the project that was headed by Yai in the substream on aging. And so it is the need of having an intergenerational agenda. And this is not only when we talk about aging, we need to talk about an intergenerational agenda, but we need to talk about an intergenerational agenda when we look at debt sustainability, when we look at climate sustainability, when we look at inequalities, and when we look at, obviously, all matters related to health. So I would really love to see this intergenerational agenda be part and the way to connect all the dots of next year G20 agenda. My personal recommendation is keep the agenda focused and really on what matters globally rather than try to cover too many things. And that has always been a problem with the G20. And another to me, very critical recommendation, I will invite the Italian presidency to invite the WHO, the World Health Organization, to become a permanent technical partner of the G20, as the IMF, the World Bank, and the OECD are already permanent partners. Thank you very much again for this very interesting seminar, and good and all the best wishes to the Italian team for the work and the challenges ahead. Thank you.
Many thanks, Paola. Thank again all of you for joining us for today's meeting. A special thanks to our panelists for their outstanding contribution, and Ambassador Benassi. The video of the webinar will be published shortly, and so will the volume we are preparing on the challenges at the upcoming Italian presidency. I'm sure we remain in contact with all of you. Needless to say, we will make sure that you will be informed and involved on all our next activities related to the G20 Italian presidency. And so the seminar ends here. Thanks again.